You built it yourself. That's the part nobody talks about anymore. You did not walk into a store and buy a slot car off the shelf and set it on the track and press a trigger. You sat at a workbench, maybe the kitchen table, maybe a desk in your bedroom, maybe a corner of the garage that your father let you have, and you built something from nothing. You chose the chassis, you chose the motor, you chose the tires and the gears and the body, and when you were done, you had a machine that did not look like anyone else's, did not sound like anyone else's, and did not race like anyone else's. It was yours. Every wire, every solder joint, every brush stroke, yours. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. The car was 7 inches long, maybe 8, 1/24th scale, big enough to fill your hand, heavy enough to feel like something real, not the little HO cars that snapped together and ran on a plastic track on your bedroom floor. Those were toys. This was engineering. This was the car you brought to the Raceway on Saturday morning, the car you'd spent all week tuning, the car that represented every dime of your allowance and every hour of your free time and every mistake you'd made and fixed and made again until it was right, until it was fast, until it could hold the corner on lane 3 at full speed without climbing the wall. The chassis came first, dynamic, Mura, Russkit, Champion, names that meant nothing to anyone outside the hobby and everything to anyone inside it. A dynamic Dynaflex wasn't just a piece of brass and piano wire, it was a philosophy. It flexed in the corners, it absorbed the bumps, it kept the tires flat on the track when every other chassis was bouncing and skipping and losing time. You chose your chassis the way a carpenter chooses his hammer, not by what it looked like, but by what it could do. And once you chose it, you learned it. You learned its weight distribution. You learned where it flexed and where it held. You learned how to adjust the rear axle 1/1000th of an inch and feel the difference on the very first lap. The motor was the heart. Champion, Mura, K and B. Some of you bought them, some of you wound them yourselves, sitting at the table with a spool of copper wire and a magnifying glass and a pair of hands that shook a little because you were 14 and this was the most precise thing you'd ever attempted. You wound the armature turn by turn, counting each wrap, knowing that one too many meant the motor would run hot and one too few meant it would run slow. When you finished and connected the leads and touched the power for the first time, the motor screamed, a high-pitched whine that went through the walls of your bedroom and told everyone in the house that something was alive in there, something you made. The body was where you became an artist, Lexan, clear, flexible, unbreakable plastic that you cut with scissors and shaped with your hands and painted from the inside. That was the secret of Lexan. You painted the details first, the stripes, the numbers, the sponsored decals, and then you painted the base color over everything. So the finished side was smooth and glossy and the painted side was hidden inside. Some of you used an airbrush, some of you used a rattle can in the backyard. One kid at your Raceway painted his body in his high school colors, black and gold, and it was the most beautiful car on the track, and everyone knew it was his before they even saw the number. The tires were the difference between winning and watching. You could not just buy tires off the rack and bolt them on, not if you wanted to compete. The serious racers poured their own. Silicone compound mixed in small batches, each racer's formula slightly different. Some liked them soft for grip. Some liked them hard for durability. Some mixed a batch for qualifying and a different batch for the race. You poured the compound into a mold, let it cure, pulled the tire, and trued it on a lathe. A contraption you built yourself from a hobby motor, a dowel rod, and a piece of sandpaper. The tire had to be perfectly round, perfectly concentric, perfectly smooth. A flat spot the size of a pinhead meant vibration at speed, and vibration at speed meant the car danced in the corners instead of gripping. You spent more time on tires than on anything else, and nobody outside the hobby would ever understand why a 14-year-old boy was staying up until midnight to sand a rubber circle to within 1/1000th of an inch. The controller was your connection to the car, not a joystick, not a button, a resistor in a pistol grip with a trigger that you squeezed, not pressed, with a sensitivity that came from practice and patience and failure. Too much trigger and the car broke loose, too little and you lost the draft. The sweet spot was somewhere in the middle, and it changed with every corner, every lap, every shift in track temperature. Some guys ran 45 ohm controllers, some ran 70, some ran 95. The higher the resistance, the more control you had at low speed and the less you had at full speed. You chose your controller the way a pool player chooses his cue, by feel, not by specification. And after a year of racing with the same controller, the trigger knew your hand the way a glove knows a fist. You brought it to the Raceway. That was the moment. You walked through the door with a car in one hand and a controller in the other, and the owner behind the counter nodded because he'd seen you every Saturday for 6 months, and he knew your car, and he knew your weaknesses, and he knew whether you'd been working on that corner entry problem he'd pointed out last week. You set your car on the tech table. You check the ride height, you check the tire compound, silicone, hand mixed, applied to the rear wheels with a lathe you'd built from a hobby motor and a dowel rod. You check the guide flag, you check the braids, and then you set it on the track and squeezed the trigger and listened, because you could hear everything. A good motor sounded clean, a bad bearing sounded rough, a loose gear sounded like it was chewing itself apart. Your ears knew your car the way a mechanic's ears know an engine. And if something was wrong, you heard it before you felt it. The P table was where you lived. A folding table next to the track where you laid out your tools and your spare parts and your tire truer and your motor spray. Every racer had his own setup. His own soldering iron, his own alignment jig, his own jar of tire sauce that he'd mixed himself and refused to share the recipe for. You sat at that table between heats and worked on your car. You adjusted the brush tension. You trued the tires. You bent the chassis rails 1/1000th of an inch to change the way the car loaded in the corners. The guy next to you was doing the same thing to his car, and neither of you talked about what you were doing, because in this world, tuning was strategy and strategy was secret. But you watched each other's hands, you learned from what you saw, not what you heard, and that was the education. Your first time at the Raceway with the car you'd built yourself was a disaster, you remember that? The car was slow. The motor was wrong, the tires were too hard, the body was too heavy because you'd used too much paint. You finished last in every heat, and the old man in lane 6 lapped you twice and didn't even look up. You went home and tore the car apart and started over. And the next Saturday, you were faster. Not fast enough, but faster. And the Saturday after that, faster still. And somewhere in those Saturdays, maybe the 5th, maybe the 10th, you finished a heat without getting lapped, and the owner behind the counter said, "Nice run," without looking up from his newspaper, and those 2 words meant more than any trophy you'd ever been handed. The race was the test. 6 lanes, 8 guys leaning over the rail. The starter counted down 3, 2, 1, and you squeezed the trigger and your car launched into the first corner, and you held your breath because this was the corner. The corner that had been killing you for 3 weeks. The corner where the track dipped slightly and the rear end broke loose, and you would lose 2 car lengths to the guy in lane 5 who had figured it out before you did. But this week you had moved the weight forward. This week you had softened the rear tire compound. This week you had adjusted the motor timing by a fraction when your car hit that corner at full speed and held, when the tires gripped and the chassis flexed and the body stayed low and you came out the other side without losing a tenth. You felt something in your chest that no video game has ever produced. You felt the reward of your own hands. The guys you raced with were not strangers. They were not avatars on a screen. They were the kid from the next town who drove a Mura chassis and swore by Champion Motors. The old man who had been racing since the tracks opened and whose car looked like it had been through a war but was still the fastest thing on the track. The teenager who had just started and whose car kept crashing because he had not learned to feather the trigger yet. You helped him. You showed him where his braids were too tight and his rear tires were too hard. Because somebody had helped you when you showed up the first time with a car that would not hold a corner, and this is how it worked. The knowledge passed from hand to hand, from car to car, from Saturday to Saturday, and the Raceway was the classroom. Every Raceway had a name. The Pit Stop in East Toledo, the Aurora Raceway in West Hempstead, Scott's in Fremont, Checkpoint in Southern California. You remember yours. You remember the layout. Which corner was fast, which corner was a trap, which lane had the advantage on the straight, and which lane had the advantage in the infield. You remember the track surface, whether it was routed masonite or painted wood or bare plywood sealed with lacquer. You remember where you stood when you raced and where you sat when you did not. You remember the light, the fluorescent tubes overhead that gave everything a faintly green tint and made the Lexan bodies glow. You remember the sound, not just the motors, but the echo, the way the whole room hummed when 6 cars were running at full speed and the walls vibrated and the air smelled like ozone and hot copper, and the world outside did not exist because the world inside was enough. The parts counter was the altar. Behind the glass, on pegboard hooks and in small plastic drawers, were the components of the fastest cars in the world. Motors wound to tolerances that professional racing teams would respect. Gears cut from brass with teeth so fine you needed a loop to count them. Tires poured from silicone compounds that each shop mixed themselves. Their own recipe, their own hardness, their own secret. Bearings, armatures, lead weights, pickup braids, guide flags, solder, wire, motor spray. You stood at that counter with your allowance in your pocket and you chose. Every choice mattered. A softer tire meant better grip but faster wear. A hotter motor meant more speed but more heat. A lighter body meant faster acceleration but less stability in the corners. You were 13 years old and you were making engineering decisions that had real consequences on the track. No adult told you what to choose. You figured it out yourself. And when you got it wrong, you came back next week and tried again. The brands that made these things are gone. Dynamic models, the chassis that changed everything, is gone. Mura, the motors that Ron Mura built by hand in San Leandro, California, the motors that powered the fastest cars in the country, is gone. Champion is gone. Russkit is gone. K&B was bought by Aurora and then was gone when Aurora went under. Cox, maker of the Chaparrals and Lotus 40s that were every kid's dream car, is gone. Revel and Monogram made slot car kits, and they are gone from that business too. The entire ecosystem, the chassis makers, the motor winders, the tire pourers, the body designers, the industry that supported a $500 million hobby vanished in less than 5 years, not because the products were bad, not because the demand disappeared overnight, but because the raceways closed. And without raceways, there was no reason to build a 1/24th scale slot car. You do not build a race car if there is no track to race on. The track died first, the car died second, the skill died last. And the skill is dying right now. The men who know how to wind a slot car motor by hand are in their 70s. The men who know how to pour a silicone tire compound from scratch are in their 80s. The men who can look at a chassis and tell you by the flex point whether it was a dynamic or a Mura or a Russkit, there are maybe a few hundred of them left in the country. When they go, that knowledge goes with them. It is not written down in a way that matters. It is not on YouTube in a way that captures it. It is in their hands, in the muscle memory of fingers that wound 10,000 turns of copper wire around an armature, in the eye that can see 1,000th of an inch misalignment in a rear axle from across a pit table, in the ear that knows the difference between a motor that is running right and one that is about to burn. You cannot download that. You cannot stream it. You cannot buy it on Amazon. It exists in the hands of men who were 14 once, and it will die when they do. Nobody is training the next generation because there is no next generation. There is no raceway to bring them to. There is no counter to stand at. There is no pit table to sit at. The infrastructure that supported the education is gone, and without it, the education ends. Some of you still have the car in a box, in the garage, in a corner of the attic where nobody goes. The body is dusty, the tires have hardened, the motor has not turned in 40 years, but the chassis is still true. The solder joints are still clean. The weight is still exactly where you put it because you put it there with precision and it has not moved since. You could clean it. You could replace the tires, you could oil the bearings and charge the motor and set it on a track and it would run. It would run the way it ran the last time you raced it. Fast, clean, exactly the way you built it. The car is ready. It has been ready for 40 years. There is just nowhere left to take it. A few of you found somewhere. There are vintage race meets, small gatherings in church basements and VFW halls and converted garages where men in their 60s and 70s bring their original cars from the 1960s and race them on wooden tracks that somebody built in their spare time. The cars are the same. The chassis flex the same way. The motors scream the same way. The controllers feel the same way in hands that are 40 years older but still know the squeeze. And for an afternoon, a single afternoon, the years fall away and the track is the Raceway and the guy in lane 4 is the guy who used to beat you every Saturday and the owner behind the counter is calling out lap times and the smell of hot motor windings fills the room. The way it used to fill the room when you were 14 and the world was 6 lanes wide and nothing mattered except the next corner. Some of you tried to teach it. You brought your grandson to the garage and showed him the chassis and the motor and the body and the tools. You showed him how the armature sits in the magnets and how the gears mesh and how the braids pick up the current. He watched politely, he asked a few questions, and then he went back inside and picked up his phone and the lesson was over. Not because he did not care, because the world he lives in does not have a place for what you were trying to give him. There is no raceway to take him to. There is no counter where he can spend his allowance on a motor. There's no Saturday morning where 6 guys lean over a rail and count down 3, 2, 1, go. The knowledge you carry has no address anymore, and that is the cruelest part of what vanished. Not the car, not the track, not the brands. The cruelest part is that you still know how to do something that nobody needs you to do. They sell slot cars now. You can find them at hobby shops and online. Carrera makes beautiful 1/24th scale cars with detailed paint and chrome and working headlights. You take them out of the box and put them on the track and press a button. They are gorgeous and fast and perfect, and they are not yours. Nobody wound the motor. Nobody poured the tires. Nobody painted the body from the inside with shaking hands and a rattle can in the backyard. Nobody chose the chassis or the gears or the weight placement. The car came finished. The car came ready, and the car will never mean what your car meant because your car had your hands in it. Your decisions, your mistakes, your Saturday mornings, your allowance, that is what vanished. Not slot cars, not 1/24th scale, not the brands or the raceways or the trophies. What vanished was the act of building something fast with your own hands and taking it somewhere to prove it. What vanished was the counter where you stood with your allowance and chose between a softer tire and a hotter motor. What vanished was the moment your car held the corner for the first time and you knew that the reason it held was because of something you did with a soldering iron at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. What vanished was the pride of authorship, the ownership of speed, the feeling that the fastest car on the track was fast because of you, not because of the box it came in, because of you. If you built a 1/24th scale slot car, tell us in the comments, what chassis did you run, and what was the fastest car you ever built?